Hello, my name is Moira Armstrong, and my presentation today is called We've Had a Pandemic Before: AIDS, COVID-19, and Queerphobia in the United Kingdom. I'll start with some background here, beginning with queerness in the 1980s in the United Kingdom. Queer people were becoming increasingly visible at this time, but there was significant backlash, particularly from the Conservative Party, which was in power under Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. In 1981, acquired immunodeficiency syndrome, or AIDS, was first observed, and it rose to epidemic levels by the end of the 1980s, particularly in queer communities. The Conservative government did not provide the help that queer people needed to navigate the pandemic, so they took it upon themselves to mount a community response. To inform that response, many queer people decided to, quote, reach back into history to discover how previous epidemics had been handled, end quote. Similarly, when the COVID-19 pandemic hit the UK in March of 2020, AIDS history became a touch point for many queer people trying to deal with the present. AIDS historiography is broad and well developed and tends to focus on queerphobia and activism. Early accounts were in first-person narratives, and over time, interdisciplinary and intersectional approaches were also used. AIDS is still considered very important to queer history, and works about it are still being published today. COVID's historiography is limited, but scholarship has touched on COVID's impact and how history will view the pandemic. But there has been little scholarly material that has dealt with both crises. This presentation will examine the queerphobia of policies adopted by Parliament and communications from the National Health Service in the UK during the crisis years of AIDS, specifically in regard to queer nightlife and sex, chosen family, and access to healthcare, and will detail how these normalized governmental queerphobia, which has led to similarly queerphobic policies and rhetoric during COVID-19. I'll be using materials from the United Kingdom's National Archives and the Queer Britain Museum's Queer Pandemic Oral History Collection to demonstrate these points. So we'll start with sex and nightlife. Nightlife, which is, quote, an amalgamation of specific sites where queer people gather, including bathhouses, saunas, clubs, bars, and pubs, end quote, has been a place where queer people gather and form sexual relationships for years. And in the 1980s in the UK, casual sex with multiple partners, challenging heteronormative sexual roles, and pursuing sex in public places was increasingly accepted. I'll play a quick clip here from Jeff Hardy, a 70-year-old gay man who lived in Southeast London in the 1980s, discussing the importance of the queer scene to his social life.
We would either meet each other in each other's houses, go to pubs, go to restaurants, or go to the social group. I've never been any good at the gay scene, or go to saunas if I'm feeling horny. For men, the sexual thing is often what does bring people together.
Despite how important this scene was to people like Jeff, the government was indifferent. This is evident in the 1987 brochure AIDS, Don't Die of Ignorance, which you see here, which attacks the queer culture of casual sex. It includes the lines, the more sexual partners you have, especially male partners, the more chance you have of having sex with someone who is infected. It is safest to stick to one faithful partner. And also, those most at risk now are men who have anal sex with other men. Queerphobia is also evident in the 1985 Public Health Infectious Diseases Regulations, which are here. And as you can see, they say, a justice of the peace may make on the application of any authority an order for the detention in hospital of an inmate of that hospital suffering from AIDS if the justice is satisfied that on his leaving the hospital, proper precautions to prevent the spread of that disease would not be taken by him in his lodging or accommodation or in other places to which he may be expected to go if not detained in the hospital. This legislation was only used once, but it reveals that AIDS was criminalized through language like inmate, and the reference to other places that patients might go demonstrates the association between queer people and casual sex in public spaces. These measures of control were ultimately unnecessary. The queer community mounted a significant public health response to AIDS, and as a result, the brochure and legislation showed that the Conservative government under Thatcher was trying to communicate that queer sex was immoral and illicit. This had a significant impact on the queer community, which engaged in deliberately sidelining historical references and unremembering of AIDS in the community for years. These movements were not universal or permanent, but were still significant in limiting liberatory sexual practices. Next, I'll move on to queer chosen family. There is no set definition for chosen family. It can include friends, lovers, co-parents, children, basically anyone who is meaningful to an individual. Despite the breadth of this category, queer chosen families all share a couple of traits. They are fluid, they are non-normative, and they emphasize personal agency in their formation, all of which makes them distinct from biological and legal or biolegal families. I'll play a clip here from Ted Jacobs, an 84-year-old mixed race gay man living in London, discussing how queer chosen family worked in his life.
My life really changed at that point. I worked in an office run by a out-and-out gay man who was quite over the top about his status, and much more than that. There were people coming and going and working there, actors and backroom people and staff from all backgrounds. Not only were we of various orientations, but in the South African context, we were from various races. It was all a merry mixture of people having to get on because it was a job to be done and really enjoying the whole situation. And I didn't like the world in South Africa outside of this kind of cocoon of the Baxter Theatre and its life and my family.
These kinds of chosen families became particularly important during AIDS. Disclosing an AIDS diagnosis was essentially coming out, so many people lost their biolegal ties and were incorporated into queer chosen families. However, chosen families did not have the same rights under the law as biolegal families, and even potential solutions, like power of attorney, were flawed. Power of attorney gives someone other than yourself the ability to make decisions if you lose the ability to do so. But there are several issues with the Enduring Powers of Attorney Act 1985, which established power of attorney guidelines during AIDS. Sorry about that. Under this act, queer people had to give notice to their relatives that they were going to enact power of attorney, exposing them to queerphobia. Their relatives could also object and block power of attorney entirely. These are some screenshots from the act. The laws of power of attorney were also revoked under death or bankruptcy, which was problematic because many disputes between chosen and biolegal family occurred after death, and because AIDS was a significant financial burden for patients and could cause them to go into bankruptcy. Finally, these laws were updated in 1994, but these two portions were left intact, despite the fact that these issues had been raised by queer people at this time. The emphasis on biolegal family exemplifies the general emphasis on the nuclear family in much of conservative politics, especially under Thatcher. It privileged a very specific kind of family union that was associated with health, safety, and normalcy, and queer people and their chosen families were outside of this ideology. As a result, they were targeted by Thatcher's practices. This had a significant impact on the queer community, particularly with Section 28. This was a part of Local Government Act 1988 that declared that, quote, a local authority shall not intentionally promote homosexuality or publish material with the intention of promoting homosexuality, promote the teaching in any maintained school of the acceptability of homosexuality as a pretended family relationship. This again undermined the legitimacy of queer families and forbade students from being taught about queerness in schools. Section 28 was not repealed until the early 2000s, and studies have shown that it still impacts education in the UK today. I'll wrap up the AIDS section with a discussion about the medical system. The medical system was extremely queerphobic at the time of the AIDS epidemic. Queerness was listed in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders until 1973, so many doctors were trained and practiced under the assumption that queerness was a mental illness. Doctors often displayed queerphobia in their practices, even if they were queer themselves, because they feared the stigma of being associated with queer people. I'm going to play another clip from Ted Jacobs now. In the last clip, we heard Ted talking about his retirement. Before he retired, he was a doctor. And in this clip, he talks about that experience during the AIDS crisis.
And then when, for instance, the AIDS epidemic came, I took precautions, and because I'm a doctor, but I didn't want to engage in any way with this calamity because somehow it didn't concern me. It was the others, the ones who lived as gay people. I mean, it's wrong now, but at the time it didn't seem wrong.
This demonstrates how queerphobic even queer providers were at this time.
And then,
in addition to facing queerphobia from doctors, queer people faced disability and chronic illness at a time when the UK was particularly hostile to disabled and chronically ill people. There was little legislation addressing these populations, and they were generally seen as personally responsible for their disabilities and thus their finances. This overlooked the Black Report, which was commissioned by the Labour Party and outlined the impact of economic inequality on health. Among its suggestions to deal with these social determinants of health was an allowance for disabled people that would have applied to AIDS patients. However, the Thatcher government ignored this, reflecting their views about individual responsibility and the view of queerness as immoral. Thatcher's refusal to address social determinants of health, as well as her privatization of some aspects of the National Health Service, had serious consequences. Poverty rates increased, as did the wealth gap and social inequalities. Thatcherism as a whole was successful in moving the political center of gravity in Britain to the right, and Boris Johnson is seen as an ideological successor to Thatcher in many ways. This is evident in the response to COVID-19. So I'm going to go over the same three areas here in regard to COVID-19 to show this comparison. So starting with sex and nightlife, under the Health Protection Coronavirus Restrictions Regulations 2020, which was the main legislation around COVID-19, the spaces of the queer scene were closed for public health reasons, and leaving your home for a non-essential reason was not allowed, which forbade many types of queer sex. There was no guidance given about how to safely pursue casual sex if people wanted to. This clip is from Adam Smith, a 36-year-old queer man in London, describing how that has impacted him.
It was sort of seen in the public imagination as like, it was on the one hand, it was a nice to have that you could easily live without. And on the other hand, it was something that a lot of people just didn't even think about. Like government guidance on like what you could and couldn't do wasn't that explicit about sex, and it was almost because, and it certainly wasn't covered in the media, in the mainstream media, about like sex as like one of the things that you could and couldn't do, that you couldn't do.
This refusal to acknowledge the culture of casual sex in the queer community indicated that it was outside the bounds of acceptable morality, similarly to the messages sent by Thatcher during AIDS.
It was
These restrictions also place the greatest value on households, and the majority of households in the UK consist of biolegal families. No provisions were made for chosen families who people might not immediately live with. In this clip, Rachel Dawson, a 32-year-old lesbian woman living in Cardiff, reflects on how this might affect queer people.
The way that we've talked about, people going out to pubs and clubs has been like, oh, that's so decadent and it's unnecessary. And you should just be like staying at home with your like nuclear family. I think that's quite a strong parallel. We don't think about the reasons why like going out to gay bars is actually an important way that you would get companionship and friendship. And not everyone has like a nuclear family that they would want to be sat at home with. Although I think both younger people and older people are likely to be a lot more vulnerable. Like when I think of an elderly gay man that I used to work with, he would go to the pub like almost every night after work, and he lived alone. He would go to the gay pub, and he wasn't really interested in cruising or anything, but he just liked being there. He liked the atmosphere and the drag and chatting to people, but he lived alone. And I don't think he's on any social media. I've got his phone number and we've texted a couple of times, but I imagine his experience is very different. The same as if you were maybe a trans person who wasn't out living with your family. And that would be just so hard.
This aligns with the Thatcherite emphasis on the nuclear family as an ideological signifier for health, safety, and normalcy. These regulations also oppress single people, which demonstrates the interconnectedness of heteronormativity and amatonormativity. Lastly, while medical settings were allowed to stay open out of necessity, they became quickly overloaded, and this situation made the state of gender-affirming care even more precarious than usual in the UK. Trans people who couldn't access this care during COVID-19 had significantly worse mental health. However, this wasn't addressed by the government. Robin Stewart, a 21-year-old non-binary person living in Scotland, discusses that in this clip.
But also I think things like the waiting list for gender clinics is not something that people have considered at all. They keep talking about the NHS waiting list, like for cancer and things like this, but they never ever bring up the gender clinics at all. I've never seen, like on the news at least, like they don't talk about it that often. I think that's something really unique.
This indicates a general lack of care for the well-being of queer people and the increase in transphobia that has been prevalent in the UK in recent years. So just to wrap up here, I want to note the limitations of this study. This by no means covers all the parallels that exist between AIDS and COVID, or even all of the queerphobia expressed by the governments during these two time periods. So those would be important topics of further study. Additionally, the majority of the queer pandemic interviewees have been white and able-bodied, and intersectional approaches that look at race and ability would also be important for further study. Want to wrap up with one last clip. This is from Lucy Allen Goss, a 36-year-old lesbian woman in North Yorkshire, England, where she voices that she expected the pandemic to be managed badly by the Conservative government, who she refers to as Tories, which is what they're colloquially called in the UK, because of their previous actions. I think it's a perfect note to end on that really ties this whole presentation together.
Wasn't super positive about the government at the beginning. I think that's the thing I found really, really difficult living here. And because sort of initially I thought, well, this is a Tory government who are going to completely fuck everything up the way they do. And I was quite, cynical about that. When the sort of Rainbows for the NHS thing happened, I remember thinking, fine, I can be relaxed about that. Yes, that's our symbol, but okay, that's all very nice. And I think now that's sort of shifted to finding that really cynical, and I didn't realise how much it would bother me that because of where we live, it's very Tory. And there's a huge perception of, isn't Boris Johnson wonderful? And who could possibly have done a better job? Isn't it great? And we all need rainbows for the NHS. And there's this sense of sort of genuine puzzlement when you talk to people that you would not be very pro-Tory. And I had someone say to us, why don't you like the Tories? But they've done such amazing things. And the first thing that came to mind for me was saying, well, yes, but they're also sort of Section 28, and you're unlikely to find two lesbians voting Tory. And they were really surprised by that.
All right, so that brings me to the end of my presentation. Thank you.